No one stepped forward at the grave. No hands reached for the crying infants. But one man stood still after all others left. A mountain tracker with no kin, no wife, no reason to care until now. The Montana sun beat down merciless on the small cemetery outside Copper Creek, a mining town carved from the wilderness like a scar on the earth. The preacher's voice cracked under the weight of dust and wind, but his words still rose, short, solemn, final. A pine coffin rested at the foot of the open earth, already weathered gray by the relentless mountain air. No one wept. No one knelt. No one claimed the two small bundles nestled in a wooden crate beside the preacher's boots. Two newborns swaddled tight and left to fate. Sarah Clearwater had died in childbirth 3 nights earlier during a Crow raiding party's attack on the settlement. No family had come forward. No husband had been named. Only her body had come to the town cemetery, carried by Doc Henderson and buried with coins collected from the miners' wages. A duty, nothing more. By the time the final prayer was said, only a handful remained. Doc Henderson, who delivered the babies, stood with his hands in his coat pockets, jaw clenched. Mayor Thompson shifted his weight beside him, eyes not on the grave, but on the tiny fists that flailed in the air as one of the twins began to cry. No one moved to hush them. And then there was Hank Morrison, known to most as Hank Bigfoot Hunter. He stood apart from the rest, boots planted in the churned earth, sweat streaming from beneath his worn leather hat. He hadn't come for the funeral. He hadn't known Sarah, but he'd been returning from a tracking expedition when he saw the small procession and, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, had followed. He should have left after the amen. Should have turned back toward his cabin and prepared for his next hunt. But he didn't. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. Well, that's settled, I suppose. Doc Henderson shifted, then glanced down at the babies. Someone's got to take them. No one answered. The blacksmith's wife whispered something to her husband. He shook his head. We've got 3 of our own, he muttered. Can't take 2 more mouths. They ain't even named, someone else said. What did Sarah call them? She didn't, the doc murmured. She didn't have the strength. Barely lived long enough to see them both breathing. Thompson scratched the back of his neck, visibly uncomfortable. Maybe the mission in Helena will take them in, or someone will come along. Someone? Doc Henderson's voice cracked. These aren't stray animals, Mayor. They're babies. They need milk, warmth, a name. I'll take them. The words cut through the mountain silence like an axe through wood. All heads turned. Hank Morrison stood still, one hand on his rifle, the other clenched at his side. Dust swirled around his boots, but his eyes were steady as granite. You, Hank? Thompson asked, baffled. You're a tracker. You live alone in the mountains hunting legends. I got a cabin. Been saving my earnings from guide work. You track Sasquatch, the blacksmith's wife said with thinly veiled skepticism. That ain't a life for raising children. I didn't ask for judgment, ma'am, Hank said quietly. He stepped forward, boots crunching in the gravel. I asked for the babies. Doc Henderson blinked at him, unsure whether to be relieved or alarmed. You got any idea what you're doing, Hank? No, Hank admitted. But neither do they, and I reckon someone ought to try. He reached the crate in 5 strides and knelt. The crying twin had gone quiet again, but both infants stirred restlessly, their faces pinched and red from the mountain air. Hank stared at them for a long moment before reaching into his pack and drawing out a soft deerskin wrap. Clumsy, unsure, he tucked it around their bodies to shield them from the wind, then lifted the crate with steady hands. No one stopped him. No one offered help. They just watched as he turned and walked back through the dust and pine-scented air, 2 newborns clutched tight in his arms like they'd always been his. The ride to his cabin was brutal. The Montana mountains were unforgiving, with treacherous trails and sudden weather changes that could kill the unprepared. His horse, Thunder, was sturdy but cautious through the rocky terrain, and Hank had to ride with one hand holding the reins and the other bracing the crate against his chest. The twins slept most of the way, too exhausted to wail. One of them shivered despite being wrapped warmly, and Hank pulled his coat tighter around the crate. By the time his cabin came into view, a sturdy log structure tucked between towering pines with smoke rising from the stone chimney, Hank's throat was dry, and his back ached from the careful riding. He dismounted stiffly, muscles protesting as he carried the crate inside. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low. The room was warm but not stifling, heated by the residual warmth from the thick log walls. Hank set the crate on his handmade table and rebuilt the fire, not for additional warmth but to heat water and prepare milk from his small store of supplies. Then he turned to the babies. They were quiet now, but their tiny faces were flushed from the mountain air. Hank stared at them for a long beat before lifting the smaller one, awkward and careful, into his arms. The child's head settled against his chest, then nestled under his bearded chin. Something in Hank's chest cracked open. He hadn't held a baby in 20 years, not since his sister's child back in Missouri before he'd headed west. Before the war. Before everything changed. He shook the memory off like snow from his shoulders. No use digging up that grave again. Not tonight. I don't know your names, he muttered to the child. Guess we'll fix that soon enough. He set to work, laid them on his own bedroll near the warmer wall, found clean cloth and rewrapped them more loosely in the mountain air, heated goat's milk in a pot and tested the temperature on the inside of his wrist. Doc Henderson had given him no instructions, but instinct took over where logic failed. He fed them with strips of clean cloth, letting the milk drip slow into their mouths, humming old ballads his mother used to sing. Outside, the mountain wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and granite through the gaps in the log walls. But inside, the cabin held steady. Hank didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the wall, one baby in each arm, listening to their shallow breaths and wondering what in God's name he'd just done. Morning came with a golden sunrise that painted the peaks in shades of fire. The babies had made it through the night, though the smaller one, a girl, he thought, breathed more shallowly than he liked. Hank fashioned a crude cradle from an old supply crate and lined it with his spare shirts. He couldn't leave them alone long, but he had to tend Thunder, fetch water from the stream, check his snares. Every chore doubled in complexity now. The twins had no names, but Hank found himself murmuring to them as he moved about the cabin. You're the fighter, he told the boy with the stronger cry. And you, little one, you're taking everything in like you're memorizing it. He tried calling them Thomas and Elizabeth, then James and Mary. None fit. He didn't realize he was talking to them constantly until halfway through feeding them again. Names don't make you family, he said quietly, but I guess they help folks know who they're talking to. He thought of his mother's Bible, the one that had traveled with him through his years as an Army scout and then as a civilian tracker. It still sat on the shelf by his bunk, worn but intact. She'd read from it every night before the fever took her. That evening, Hank opened it, turned the pages with careful fingers until he found names that made his chest ache in a strange, good way. Daniel, he said softly to the boy, you fight hard for what you need. Then to the girl, Hope, because that's what brought you to me when everything else seemed lost. Daniel and Hope Morrison. The names stuck. He whispered them into the firelight over and over like a prayer he'd forgotten he remembered. But prayers didn't keep trouble away. 3 days later, Mayor Thompson rode up to Hank's cabin with another man, a stranger in a black suit despite the mountain heat. They didn't dismount, just sat their horses in the shade and waited, the stranger's eyes cold as winter streams. Hank opened the door with Hope on his hip and didn't say a word. Need to talk, Hank, Thompson said. Hank stepped aside. The fire crackled softly, the room filled with the scent of milk and wood smoke. This is Mr. Carlisle from the Territorial Children's Services, Thompson said after a long silence. There's been questions raised about the children. Hank's blood chilled. What kind of questions? Carlisle spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as a snake's belly. Questions about your suitability as a guardian, Mr. Morrison. A single man living alone in the wilderness, tracking questionable creatures. It's hardly an appropriate environment for children. They're fed, warm, and safe. For now, Carlisle said. But what happens when winter comes? When you disappear into the mountains for weeks at a time? Children need stability, education, proper socialization. I provide what they need. Do you? Because what I see is 2 infants being raised by a man who chases fairy tales for a living. Carlisle's gaze moved deliberately over the cabin's rough interior, the hunting equipment, the maps marked with sightings of creatures most people didn't believe existed. The territory has institutions better equipped to handle orphan children. They're not orphans. They're mine. Legally, Mr. Morrison, they belong to the state until proper arrangements can be made. I have papers from Helena authorizing their removal. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Hank, maybe it's for the best. The orphanage in Helena has resources, teachers, and walls, Hank said flatly, and rules that'll teach them the world's got no room for dreams or wonder. Carlyle stood and brushed dust from his suit. I'll return tomorrow with a wagon. Have them ready. The two men left, and Hank stood in his doorway with hope stirring against his chest and Daniel sleeping in the crate behind him. The mountain wind carried the scent of coming snow from the high peaks, and for the first time since taking the children, Hank felt truly afraid. That evening, as he fed the babies by lamplight, Hank made his decision. He couldn't fight the territorial government, couldn't change their minds about his worthiness as a guardian. But he could run. The mountains were vast, full of hidden valleys and forgotten trails where a man could disappear if he knew the country well enough. He pulled out his survey maps and spread them on the table. His finger traced remote canyons and high meadows, places where even the most determined pursuit would lose the trail. There were old mining camps, abandoned homesteads, valleys that hadn't seen white men in years. By dawn, everything was decided. He packed light but thoroughly: jerky, hardtack, milk powder, warm clothes for the babies, his rifle and sidearm, medical supplies, and most importantly, the knowledge he'd gained from 15 years of tracking through some of the most remote country in Montana. He fashioned carrying slings that would keep Daniel and Hope secure against his body during hard travel. Thunder was strong and sure-footed, and Hank trusted the horse more than any human authority. He left the cabin as he'd found it, ready for his return if that day ever came. They rode north toward the Beartooth Mountains as the sun painted the valley in shades of gold and purple. Hank didn't speak, just listened to the soft sounds of the babies and the steady rhythm of hooves on stone. For the first time in days, he felt something like peace. The first night they camped in a canyon sheltered from the wind by high stone walls. Hank built a small fire ringed with rocks and kept the babies close against his body for warmth. The mountain nights were cold even in summer, and their small bodies generated precious heat. He stared at the stars appearing one by one above the canyon rim and thought about his choices, all the trails that had led him here, carrying two infants into the wilderness with no destination but freedom. The second day was harder. The trail grew steep and treacherous. Thunder stumbled once on loose scree, nearly throwing them all down a slope that dropped into nothing. Hope cried for hours, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and made Hank's chest tight with worry. Daniel stayed unusually quiet, too quiet, his eyes dull and his body limp. By evening they reached a high valley green with summer grass and fed by snowmelt streams. There was an old trapper's cabin, abandoned but still weatherproof, with walls thick enough to keep out the mountain wind. Hank carried the babies inside and built a fire in the stone fireplace. They ate and slept fitfully while he kept watch. The third day brought riders. Hank saw the dust cloud before he heard the hoofbeats. 8 men, riding hard, spread out in a search pattern. He recognized Carlyle's black suit among them, along with what looked like territorial marshals. There was nowhere to run. The valley had only one way out, and they were already blocking it. Hank stood in the doorway of the trapper's cabin, rifle ready, the babies behind him wrapped in warm blankets. The riders approached slow and deliberate, weapons drawn. Carlyle dismounted 50 yards away. End of the trail, Morrison. You've made this harder than it needed to be. They're not property to be claimed and distributed. They're wards of the territory, and you're in violation of multiple laws. Carlyle gestured to his men. We can do this easy or hard. Hank stepped fully outside, rifle across his chest. Hard then. One of the marshals raised his weapon. Hank swung his rifle toward the threat. For a moment, the valley held its breath. Then another voice cut through the tension. Lower your weapons. Doc Henderson rode into the clearing with a small group of men from Copper Creek behind him. The town's miners and ranchers, men who knew Hank's character even if they didn't understand his profession. Henderson dismounted and walked between Hank and the marshals. "What's the meaning of this?" Carlyle straightened his coat. "Territorial business, Doctor. We're recovering abandoned children." "These children weren't abandoned," Henderson replied. "They were legally placed with Hank Morrison in front of witnesses. I have the documentation." "Documentation?" Carlyle's confidence wavered slightly. "What documentation?" Henderson pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Testimony from everyone present at the burial. Mayor Thompson's signature as a witness. My own medical recommendation that the children remain with Mr. Morrison, who has demonstrated adequate care." One of the Copper Creek men, a grizzled miner named Pete McKenzie, spat tobacco juice and spoke up. "Hank Morrison's tracked lost children out of these mountains when your territorial boys gave up. He's brought home more folks than you've ever helped." Another voice joined in. "Spent 2 weeks last winter hunting for the Henderson boy when he got lost in that blizzard. Never took a dime for it." Henderson continued, "What I see here is armed men threatening a citizen who's caring for children placed in his custody by community decision. That seems like overreach to me." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Mountain wind stirred the grass between two groups of armed men while somewhere behind them, one of the babies began to cry. Finally, Carlyle holstered his weapon. "This isn't over." "No," Henderson agreed. "But it's not starting here either. When you get back to Helena, you tell whoever sent you that Copper Creek takes care of its own. And Hank Morrison is one of ours." Carlyle and his men mounted and rode away, their dust cloud fading into the afternoon shadows. Henderson turned to Hank. "You can't keep running, Hank. Can't stay and fight a rigged game either." "Maybe, but there might be another way." Henderson walked to his horse and pulled out a leather pouch. "Sarah Clearwater left this. We found it in her belongings after the burial. Letters, mostly. And something that changes things." Hank stared at the pouch, afraid to hope. Henderson continued, "Turns out Sarah wasn't just passing through Copper Creek. She'd been corresponding with your sister back in Missouri, Anna Morrison. Sarah was coming to find you specifically, said in her letters she'd heard about a man who helped lost people find their way home. She was hoping you'd help her start a new life." "My sister? Anna's been dead 15 years. "No, she hasn't. She's alive and well in Kansas City, running a boarding house for travelers. She's been looking for you since the war ended." Henderson held out the pouch. "Sarah had Anna's address, her letters. Seems your sister's been placing advertisements in territorial papers trying to find you." Hank took the pouch with shaking hands. Inside were letters in his sister's familiar handwriting, describing her life, her search for her lost brother, her hope that someday they'd be reunited. The final letter was from Sarah Clearwater to Anna Morrison. "I found your brother in Montana Territory. The stories are true. He helps people who have nowhere else to turn. I'm traveling to Copper Creek with my unborn children, hoping he'll help us build a life worth living. If anything happens to me, I pray he'll remember family is more than blood. It's whoever shows up when showing up matters most." The valley was quiet except for wind through the grass and the soft sounds of children awakening. Hank folded the letters carefully and looked up at Henderson. "Anna's really alive?" "Very much so. And she's been searching for you for years. The letter says she'll come west if you need her, or you could go back to Kansas City. Either way, you've got family backing your claim on these children." That evening, as they camped by the stream before riding back to Copper Creek, Hank sat with Daniel on his knee and Hope cradled in his arm. The babies watched the firelight dance, content and trusting. Henderson dozed against his saddle while the other men kept quiet watch. For the first time since that day at Sarah's grave, Hank allowed himself to believe it was over. Not just the running, not just the fear, but the long loneliness that had followed him since the war. These children had given him something he'd never expected to find again. A reason to be more than just a tracker, more than just a man getting by. He looked down at Hope, who had wrapped her small fingers around his thumb, and at Daniel, who was fighting sleep with the determined expression of someone much older. "I love you," he whispered. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, and the words felt strange on his tongue. But they were true, truer than anything he'd ever sworn to in all his years of solitary wandering. Hope made a soft sound and nestled closer. Daniel's eyes finally closed, his breathing deep and peaceful. The stars came out one by one over the Montana mountains, and Hank Morrison, now simply a father, held his children close and watched the night sky with something approaching peace. The return to Copper Creek was different this time. Word had spread about the confrontation, about Henderson's intervention, about the letters that proved Hank had family backing his claim. When Hank rode through the town's single street with the babies secure in their slings, people nodded with respect that had nothing to do with his tracking reputation. Doc Henderson examined both children and pronounced them healthy despite their adventure. "Mountain air agrees with them," he said with a smile. "They're strong like their father." The cabin felt different now, not like a hideout but like home. Hank made improvements: proper cribs carved from pine logs, better ventilation for the mountain winters, a larger store of supplies. He cleared a garden patch behind the house and built a pen for goats. The babies watched everything with wide eyes, as if they understood they were watching their world take permanent shape. Daniel began crawling that fall, pulling himself across the rough-hewn floor with determination that reminded Hank of mountaineers under avalanche conditions. Hope learned to sit up and clap her hands when he sang to her. Both children laughed often, bright sounds that filled the cabin with joy Hank had never imagined possible. The letter from Anna arrived in October, carried by the mail rider who served the remote settlements. Her handwriting was exactly as he remembered. "My dearest brother, I've been searching for you for so long I'd almost given up hope." Then Dr. Henderson's letter arrived, and I wept for joy. "Not only are you alive, but you've become a father. I'm so proud of you, Hank. Mother would be proud too. I'm making arrangements to come west in the spring. Those babies need an aunt, and I need to see my brother again. All my love, Anna." That winter was the hardest Hank had ever faced, but also the most rewarding. The Montana mountains buried the cabin under 6 feet of snow, and for months they were cut off from the outside world. But inside, the three of them created their own universe of warmth and routine. Hank learned the deeper rhythms of infant care: when to feed, when to walk the floor, how to soothe Daniel's coughing fits and help Hope through her restless nights. He carved toys from pine knots, told stories of his tracking adventures, edited for young ears, and sang every song he could remember from his Missouri childhood. When spring finally broke winter's grip and the snow began to melt, Anna arrived on the first stage that could make it through the mountain passes. She was older, grayer, but unmistakably his sister. She held Hank for a long time, then took each baby in turn, tears streaming down her face. "They're beautiful, Hank. They're perfect. They saved me, Anna. I didn't know how lost I was until I found them." Anna stayed through the summer, helping with the children and slowly drawing Hank back into the human world he'd almost forgotten. She convinced him to take on more legitimate tracking work, finding lost cattle, mapping new settlements, guiding survey parties. The money was better than hunting legends, and it kept him closer to home and family. But most importantly, she helped him understand that his years of tracking Bigfoot and other mountain mysteries hadn't been wasted time. They'd prepared him for the most important hunt of his life: the search for meaning, for connection, for love in a world that often seemed empty of all three. "You found what you were really looking for," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching Daniel and Hope play in the garden. "You just didn't know it yet." The years that followed were marked by the steady accumulation of ordinary joys. Daniel learned to walk by pulling himself up on Hank's leg, then toddling across the cabin floor with arms outstretched toward his father. Hope followed soon after, more cautious but equally determined. Their first steps were toward him, always toward him. When Daniel was 3 and Hope nearly as tall, Hank began teaching them to read using charcoal on smooth pieces of bark. Hope had a quick mind for letters. Daniel preferred numbers and patterns. Both children learned to identify animal tracks, weather signs, and the subtle indicators that meant safety or danger in the mountains. Anna had returned to Kansas City but visited every summer, bringing books and news from the outside world. She convinced Hank to send reports to newspapers about his tracking work, and slowly his reputation grew from "that crazy Sasquatch hunter" to "the best tracker in Montana territory." Other settlers had noticed his success as a father. When families faced tragedy or hardship, They often brought their problems to the man who'd raised 2 thriving children alone in the wilderness. Hank found himself serving as an unofficial mediator, counselor, and source of practical wisdom for the growing community around Copper Creek. But it was more than knowledge. It was love made practical, day by day, hour by hour. When Daniel broke his leg falling from a tree, Hank sat with him through the long nights, telling stories to distract from the pain. When Hope had nightmares about wild animals in the forest, he moved her bed closer to his and sang until dawn. They grew into the landscape around them. Daniel could track deer across stone, read weather in cloud patterns, and gentle a frightened horse with his voice alone. Hope learned every plant that grew within 20 miles of the cabin, which ones healed and which ones harmed, how to find water by watching birds and insects. But they also grew into kindness. Daniel, for all his love of horses and hunting, would spend hours teaching Hope to whittle or helping her gather berries without eating them all. Hope, sharp-minded and observant, never used her intelligence to wound, only to protect and understand. On Sundays, Hank read to them from his mother's Bible, not from duty but from tradition, passing on the rhythms and cadences that had shaped his own childhood. The children listened with the patience of mountain-born souls, understanding that some things were sacred not for their excitement but for their permanence. When they were old enough to ask about their birth mother, Hank told them the truth simply and completely. Sarah Clearwater had been brave and kind, had died bringing them into the world during dangerous times. She had wanted them to be loved, and that love had led them to him. "Are we really yours?" Hope asked when she was 5, sitting in his lap while Daniel played with carved animals by the fire. "Really and truly," Hank answered, "not because of papers or laws, but because love made us family." "Will you always be our papa?" "Always," he said, and meant it with every breath in his body. The challenges came, as they always did on the frontier. A harsh winter that lasted 7 months tested every family's endurance. Blackfoot raiders, driven from their traditional hunting grounds, sometimes struck at isolated homesteads. Claim jumpers, cattle thieves, and men with grievances against successful trackers all posed occasional threats. But the cabin in the Montana mountains had become something more than a home. It was a landmark of stability in a shifting world. Travelers knew they could shelter at Hank Morrison's place during storms. Native families trusted him to help find lost children when tribal scouts failed. Other settlers brought their questions about tracking and survival to the man who'd mastered both. When Daniel was 7 and Hope 6, a new territorial administrator arrived with plans to modernize the relationships between remote settlers and territorial authority. Word came down that children in isolated areas would be required to attend proper schools, their education supervised by certified teachers. Hank requested a meeting with the administrator, a thin man named Whitmore who'd never been farther into the wilderness than the territorial capital. The meeting was formal, held in Copper Creek's new town hall with Mayor Thompson present. "Mr. Morrison," Whitmore said after reviewing Hank's file, "I understand you've created an unconventional family situation here. While your dedication is commendable, these children need proper education, social development, preparation for civilized life. They can read, write, and cipher better than most adults in the territory," Hank replied. "They know history, geography, and natural science from living it every day. But do they know how to function in proper society? Can they interact with other children? Are they prepared for the realities of their place in the world?" Hank understood the coded language. The administrator saw 2 mixed-race children being raised by an eccentric mountain man as a problem to be corrected. "What place would that be, sir?" Whitmore realized he'd revealed too much. "I think we understand each other, Mr. Morrison. The territory has excellent boarding schools. The children would receive proper education, religious instruction, social training. They have education, they have faith, and they know exactly who they are and where they belong. Where they belong, Mr. Morrison, is in civilization, not isolated in the mountains with a man who chases mythical creatures for a living." That evening, Hank sat on his porch watching Daniel and Hope play in the meadow with a family of young deer they'd somehow befriended. The children's laughter carried on the mountain air, mixing with bird songs and the distant sound of water over stone. He could fight the territorial government, but that might put the children at risk. He could flee deeper into the wilderness, but that would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Or he could find another way. Hope noticed his troubled expression and climbed into his lap. "Papa, what's wrong?" He smoothed her dark hair, so like her mother's must have been. "Just thinking, little one." "About what?" How could he explain the weight of other people's fears and prejudices to a 6-year-old who'd never known anything but acceptance? "About how to keep our family together," he said finally. Daniel looked up from the deer. "Are we going somewhere?" "Maybe. Would that frighten you?" The boy considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "Only if we went without you." "That will never happen," Hank promised and pulled both children close. The decision, when it came, arrived with the autumn mail. A letter from Anna, along with legal documents and a newspaper clipping. "Dearest Hank, I've been in contact with officials here in Kansas City about your situation. It seems the territorial administrators are exceeding their authority. I've engaged a lawyer who specializes in homestead rights and family law. The enclosed documents establish your legal claim as the children's guardian, witnessed and notarized. But more importantly, I have news. The Kansas Pacific Railroad is hiring scouts and guides for their western expansion. The pay is excellent, the work is steady, and it would keep you closer to civilization without sacrificing your skills. Think about it. The children would have access to proper schools while still growing up with their father. Love, Anna." The legal documents were thorough and properly executed. The railroad contract offered steady employment with good pay and benefits. The newspaper clipping described the growing demand for experienced guides as the frontier moved west. Hank folded the letter and looked out across the valley that had been his home for 5 years. The mountains were beautiful, but beauty wasn't everything. Opportunity mattered too. And his children's future mattered most of all. That evening, he gathered Daniel and Hope around the fire and told them about their aunt's proposal. They listened with the serious attention they gave to all important family discussions. "Would we still live together?" Hope asked. "Always. We just live in a different place, with more people around." "Would you still track things?" Daniel wanted to know. "Different things. Railroad routes instead of Bigfoot tracks. Lost settlements instead of mountain legends." Hope was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mama Sarah wanted us to find you. Maybe now we're supposed to help you find something new." Out of the mouths of babes. Hank realized his daughter had grasped something he'd been struggling with, that life was a series of journeys, and sometimes the greatest courage lay in beginning a new one. 3 weeks later, they loaded their belongings into a wagon and began the journey to Kansas City. The cabin remained standing, a monument to the years when a mountain tracker had learned to become a father. But the future lay ahead, not behind. The railroad work proved perfect for Hank's skills and temperament. He scouted routes through difficult terrain, guided survey parties through hostile territory, and helped establish settlements along the expanding rail lines. The pay was steady, the work challenging, and most importantly, it kept him home most nights with his children. Daniel and Hope attended the Kansas City public schools, excelling academically while maintaining the outdoor skills their mountain upbringing had provided. They made friends easily, their unique background making them interesting rather than outcasts. Teachers marveled at their knowledge of natural history and practical skills that most city children never acquired. Anna welcomed them into her boarding house, and gradually they became part of the extended family of travelers, railroad workers, and frontier families that made up her community. The children learned about different cultures, different ways of life, different possibilities for their futures. But they never forgot their origins. Every summer, Hank took them back to Montana for hunting and fishing trips that kept them connected to the wilderness that had shaped them. These journeys became legendary among the railroad crews. The scout who could find anything and his 2 children who could track a whisper through the mountains. When Daniel was 12 and Hope 11, Hank received a letter from an unexpected source. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., was organizing scientific expeditions to catalog and study the American West. They'd heard of his reputation and wanted him to lead tracking teams for their researchers. "It's legitimate scientific work," the letter explained. "No more chasing legends. Though if you should happen to encounter any unusual species, we'd certainly be interested in your professional observations. The offer represented everything Hank had dreamed of during his solitary years in the mountains: respect for his skills, scientific credibility, and work that mattered to the larger world. But more than that, it offered his children a glimpse into fields of study and opportunity he'd never imagined for them. That evening, as they sat around Anna's dinner table, Hank shared the Smithsonian's offer with his family. "Would we travel?" Hope asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Sometimes. To places no white people have ever seen, with scientists who want to understand and preserve rather than just exploit." "That sounds like the best kind of tracking," Daniel said. "Finding things that need to be found." Anna smiled at her brother. "It sounds like you've found your calling, Hank. Your real calling." The years with the Smithsonian were the most fulfilling of Hank's professional life. He led expeditions into unmapped territories, helped establish the first systematic studies of Western wildlife, and contributed to scientific understanding of the frontier ecosystem. His reports were published in journals, his maps used by subsequent explorers, his tracking methods studied and replicated. But more importantly, his children grew up at the intersection of civilization and wilderness, science and adventure, stability and exploration. Daniel developed into a gifted naturalist and photographer, documenting species and behaviors that science was just beginning to understand. Hope became fascinated with linguistics and ethnography, studying the languages and customs of the native tribes they encountered during expeditions. Both children learned to see their father not just as a parent but as a pioneer in a new kind of exploration, one that combined respect for indigenous knowledge with scientific methodology that sought to understand rather than simply conquer the wilderness. The final chapter of their story unfolded gradually, like sunrise over the Great Plains. Daniel grew into a man who combined his father's tracking instincts with formal scientific training, eventually becoming one of the first professional wildlife photographers in the American West. His images appeared in magazines and museums, helping Eastern audiences understand the majesty and fragility of the frontier ecosystem. Hope became a teacher and then a writer, documenting the stories of frontier families like their own, the mixed heritage, the chosen bonds, the triumph of love over convention. Her books became required reading in the new public schools that were spreading across the territories, teaching children that family came in many forms and that courage was often found in the most unexpected places. Both children married and had children of their own, but they never moved far from Kansas City, where Anna continued to run her boarding house well into her 70s. Family dinners included 3 generations gathered around her long table, telling stories and sharing the accumulated wisdom of lives lived at the intersection of civilization and wilderness. Hank aged into the role of patriarch with the same quiet competence he'd brought to tracking and child-rearing. His hair went white, his hands grew gnarled from decades of outdoor work, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. Grandchildren climbed on his lap to hear stories of mountain camps and scientific expeditions, of the day he found their parents and decided to become a father. On his 70th birthday, surrounded by the sprawling family that had grown from one man's decision to love 2 abandoned children, Hank raised a glass of Anna's wine and offered a toast. "To second chances," he said. "To the courage to love when love seems impossible. To family in all its forms. And to the faith that what we're truly looking for will find us when we're ready to see it." The assembled family echoed his words, and in that moment, the circle was complete. A Bigfoot hunter who'd found his purpose not in chasing legends but in creating them, not in solitude but in service to the small souls who'd needed him most. As the sun set over the Kansas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hank Morrison sat on Anna's porch and watched his great-grandchildren play in the garden she'd planted decades earlier. The Montana mountains seemed very far away now, but their lessons remained, that survival required more than skill, that home was wherever love took root, and that family was not about blood or law but about the choice to stay when staying mattered most. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of children's laughter mixing with evening bird songs, and knew with absolute certainty that every difficult decision, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice along the way had led to this perfect, ordinary moment of contentment. The story that began with a Bigfoot hunter standing alone at a grave had become the story of a family, a legacy, a testament to the truth that love, once given freely, multiplies beyond all expectation or understanding. In his final years, Hank often returned to the question that had driven his younger self into the mountains. What was he really hunting for? The answer, he realized, had been there all along in the eyes of two newborn children who needed someone to love them. He'd been hunting for purpose, for connection, for the chance to matter in ways that went beyond his own survival. He'd found it not in the legendary creatures of mountain folklore, but in the very real miracle of two small lives that had transformed a lonely tracker into the patriarch of a thriving family. The greatest discovery of his career hadn't been elusive and mysterious. It had been crying in a wooden crate beside a fresh grave, waiting for someone brave enough to reach out and claim it. Some hunts, he learned, ended not with capture but with surrender. Not with proof but with faith. Not with solitude but with love so abundant it echoed through generations, creating legends far more lasting than any footprint in the snow. The mountains still called to him sometimes, whispering of mysteries yet unsolved, tracks yet untraced. But their voices were quieter now than the laughter of his grandchildren, fainter than the sound of his great-grandchildren learning to read from the same Bible that had traveled with him through all his wandering years. He had become, without ever intending it, the very thing he'd spent years searching for in the wilderness. A legendary figure whose story would be told and retold, not because of what he'd hunted, but because of what he'd found when he stopped hunting and started loving instead. The Bigfoot hunter had finally tracked down his quarry. It had been waiting for him all along in a cemetery in Copper Creek, Montana, disguised as two babies who needed a father as much as he needed them.